The Bible you were shown is not the Bible that was written. That's not an opinion. That's history. For centuries, European institutions controlled which manuscripts were copied, which images were preserved, and which identities were emphasized. And in that process, one thing was systematically altered: the appearance of the people in the Bible. Here is the point they never say clearly. Most biblical figures came from regions where people were dark-skinned, yet they are almost always portrayed as white. That alone should raise questions. The prophets of the Bible did not come from Europe. They came from North Africa, the Levant, and the Horn of Africa, regions populated by melanated people long before modern racial categories existed. This isn't speculation, it's geography. Abraham came from Mesopotamia. Moses was raised in Egypt. Solomon ruled over Israel at the crossroads of Africa and Asia. The prophets lived under African dynasties, traded with African kingdoms, and interacted constantly with African peoples. Yet open almost any modern Bible illustration, church mural, or Sunday school book, and what do you see? Pale skin, straight hair, European facial structure. That disconnect is not accidental. Let's be precise. Ancient Hebrew texts never describe prophets as white, ever. What they do describe are physical traits consistent with people of color, hair texture, skin tone comparisons, and regional identifiers that modern readers conveniently ignore. Take Moses. The Bible describes Moses marrying a Cushite woman. Cush was not symbolic. Cush was a real African kingdom south of Egypt associated with dark-skinned people. The text does not treat this as shocking. It treats it as normal. Now ask yourself something simple. If Moses lived among Africans, married into Africa, and operated within African-controlled Egypt, why is he painted like a European monk? Because when Christianity spread into Europe, it didn't just bring theology. It brought image control. Visuals matter. Most people don't read ancient manuscripts. They absorb belief through paintings, statues, and icons. And once European powers dominated the church, those images began to reflect European faces, not historical reality. This is where the whitewashing happened. Not overnight, not through one conspiracy, but through repetition. Generation after generation grew up seeing prophets who looked nothing like the regions they came from. Over time, those images replaced the truth. And here's the key point most people miss. Changing the image changes the authority. When prophets are portrayed as European-looking, their wisdom is subconsciously associated with Europe. Power shifts, legacy shifts, ownership shifts. This isn't about modern race politics. This is about historical control. And the evidence didn't disappear. It was simply pushed aside. Ancient Ethiopian manuscripts preserve biblical figures with dark skin. Early Coptic Christian art in Egypt shows prophets with African features. Even early Roman descriptions note foreign, dark-complexioned figures coming from the east and south. But those sources rarely make it into mainstream churches. Instead, the Western Church standardized a version of the Bible that looked familiar to Europeans, not accurate to antiquity. And once that version became dominant, questioning it became uncomfortable. Because if the prophets weren't white, then history wasn't centered where we were taught it was. And that's the real reason this topic was softened, blurred, and avoided. This video isn't about emotion. It's about alignment. Aligning belief with geography, archaeology, and original context. In the next part, we'll get even more specific. We're going to look at descriptions straight from Scripture, not modern artwork, and break down what they actually say about the appearance of biblical figures. And once you see it, plainly, it becomes very hard to unsee. Let's stop talking vibes and get specific. If people were whitewashed, the proof has to be in the text itself, not opinions, not modern art. And it is. The Bible does describe physical traits. They're just rarely highlighted in sermons. Let's start with hair. In multiple ancient Near Eastern cultures, hair texture was a marker of ethnicity. Hebrew and Egyptian sources distinguish straight hair from woolly or tightly coiled hair. When descriptions appear, they matter. In Numbers 12, Moses is criticized for marrying a Cushite woman. The complaint isn't about foreign politics. It's about appearance and ethnicity. Kushites were known throughout the ancient world for dark skin and African features. This wasn't metaphorical. Classical Greek writers, Egyptian reliefs, and Assyrian records all describe Kushites as visibly dark. Now here's the part people avoid saying plainly. The text does not describe Moses as visually different from the Kushite woman. That matters. If Moses had been European-looking, the marriage would have been framed as radically foreign. Instead, the story treats it as socially tense, not biologically shocking. That implies shared regional appearance. Next, Solomon. Solomon ruled over Israel at the height of African and Arabian influence. His trade networks extended into Sheba, a kingdom located in what is now Ethiopia and Yemen, both populated by dark-skinned peoples. The Queen of Sheba's visit is not exoticized as encountering someone visually alien. There is no racial shock language. The exchange is diplomatic, intellectual, and mutual. If Solomon looked European and she was African, ancient writers would have mentioned it. They always did. They didn't. Then there's Jeremiah. Jeremiah is imprisoned and later rescued by Ebed-Melech, explicitly identified as a Cushite, an African. The text gives him a name, status, and authority. He speaks directly to the king and is trusted. This isn't background noise. It shows Africans embedded in Israelite power structures, not as outsiders, but as participants. Now, let's address the elephant in the room, skin tone language. Lamentations describes people whose skin became darker due to famine and hardship, using comparisons to soot and darkness. These descriptions only make sense if baseline skin tone was already brown to dark. You don't describe pale people becoming blackened unless darkness is already familiar and culturally meaningful. This isn't modern race talk. It's ancient descriptive language. Now, archaeology. Ancient Israel sat between Egypt and Nubia, both African civilizations. Egypt controlled the Levant multiple times during biblical history. Nubians ruled Egypt during the 25th dynasty, a fact often skipped in religious education. During that period, African rulers governed lands directly adjacent to Israel. That means prophets lived under African political dominance at various times. This isn't fringe theory, it's accepted Egyptology. So ask the obvious question. If African dynasties ruled the region, if Israelites lived under African control, if trade, marriage, and military movement flowed freely, why would prophets look European? They wouldn't. Now let's talk about early Christian art, because this is where the cover-up becomes visible. The earliest depictions of biblical figures come from Egypt, Ethiopia, and Syria, not Europe. These images show prophets with dark skin, broad noses, and textured hair. European depictions appear centuries later. When Christianity became state-sponsored under Rome, imagery shifted. Artists began depicting figures that looked Roman, lighter skin, straight hair, European bone structure. Not because new evidence emerged, but because power changed hands. This is critical. The text didn't change. The visuals did. Once images were standardized, the Audi became theological tools. A white-looking prophet subtly implies European spiritual authority. That's not accidental. Now here's something rarely mentioned. Ancient Hebrews were classified by Romans as Syro-African, not European. Roman writers grouped Jews with North Africans and Eastern peoples, not with Gauls or Germans. That classification wasn't ideological, it was observational. Skin tone, facial structure, and hair type were visibly distinct, which means the white prophet image is historically impossible. So why does this still matter? Because imagery shapes belief. If prophets look European, then Europe becomes the center of spiritual legitimacy. Africa becomes peripheral, despite being central to the actual history. This is why Ethiopian Christianity predates many European churches. This is why African manuscripts preserve older biblical traditions. This is why the discomfort exists. The whitewashing wasn't just cosmetic. It shifted ownership of sacred history. And once that shift happened, correcting it threatened institutions. So instead of openly rewriting the story, history was reframed quietly through art, education, and omission. The next chunk will confront the hardest part. why this wasn't corrected once the evidence was known, and who benefited from keeping it blurred, because by that point, it was no longer about truth. It was about control. By the time European churches realized the prophets didn't look like them, the problem wasn't ignorance, it was inconvenience. Because by the 4th century, Christianity stopped being persecuted and started being weaponized. Once Rome adopted Christianity, the faith needed to match Roman authority. And authority has a look. Roman emperors did not portray gods or heroes that resembled conquered peoples. They portrayed power in their own image. This wasn't new, it was policy. So when biblical figures were depicted, artists didn't consult ancient manuscripts or African iconography. They modeled prophets after Roman elites: pale skin, narrow noses, straight hair. Not because anyone believed this was historically accurate, but because it reinforced who now ruled the faith. Here's the part most people miss. Early Christian communities objected. We have records of theological disputes not over doctrine, but imagery. Eastern churches, especially in Egypt and Ethiopia, preserved darker-skinned depictions of biblical figures well into the Middle Ages. These weren't symbolic, they were inherited. European churches labeled them primitive or non-canonical, not because they were false, but because they conflicted with Rome's visual authority. Once images became standardized, they became tools, and tools get used. White prophets subtly communicated that spiritual legitimacy flowed through Europe. African Christianity, older, deeper, textually rich, was pushed to the margins. This is why Ethiopian Christianity is often described as isolated instead of foundational. Now let's get specific. The Ge'ez Bible, preserved in Ethiopia, contains some of the oldest biblical texts on earth. Some books included in Ethiopian canon predate their European equivalents. That alone should make Ethiopia central to biblical history. Instead, it's treated as an appendix. Why? Because acknowledging African custodianship of Scripture complicates the narrative that Europe inherited spiritual authority directly. Now look at Hebrew anthropology. Ancient Israelites were not Europeans by Roman standards. Roman ethnographers classified Jews alongside Egyptians and Syrians, not Celts or Germans. This wasn't political. Romans were obsessive classifiers. They grouped people by appearance, and Jews were not considered white. That classification persisted until Europe needed biblical figures to resemble itself. Once Europe's global expansion began, this became even more necessary. Colonialism depends on hierarchy, and hierarchy depends on symbolism. A white prophet suggests divine alignment with whiteness. A black prophet disrupts that logic entirely. This is why African features were gradually softened in art, then erased. First the nose narrows, then the hair straightens, then the skin lightens. Each change seems minor. Together, they rewrite ownership. Now let's address the most uncomfortable reality. This wasn't accidental. By the 15th century, European theologians were fully aware that biblical geography placed Israel in an Afro-Asiatic zone. They knew Egyptians were African. They knew Cushites were black. They knew trade routes connected Israel to Africa more than Europe. They wrote it down, and then ignored it in imagery, because correcting the visuals would raise questions. Questions like, why does Africa disappear from sacred history if it was always there? Why do European churches claim lineage over texts preserved elsewhere? Why are African Christians portrayed as converts instead of heirs? Those questions threaten authority. So instead of debating them, institutions chose silence. Now consider how this affected education. Biblical art became teaching material. Paintings, stained glass, illustrated Bibles, these weren't decoration. They were theology for illiterate populations. If every prophet looks European, the message becomes subconscious truth. By the time literacy spread, the imagery was already normalized. At that point, challenging it felt radical, even though the original change was the radical act. Now let's ground this further. When archaeology expanded in the 19th century, European scholars excavated Africa and the Near East. They documented statues, reliefs, and remains with clearly African features. Their field notes often describe this plainly. But museum reconstructions frequently altered those features, lighter tones, Europeanized faces, not because the artifacts demanded it, but because audiences expected familiarity. So even when physical evidence surfaced, presentation filtered it. This is how whitewashing survives evidence, not by denying facts, but by controlling framing. And here's the key point. Once whiteness became associated with holiness, it became self-reinforcing. Anything darker felt incorrect. Anything African felt symbolic. Anything honest felt political, which is why the conversation stalls today. People don't argue because the evidence is weak. They argue because the implication is strong. If prophets were black or brown, then Africa is not peripheral to sacred history. It is central. And that destabilizes centuries of assumed inheritance. The next chunk addresses the final layer of resistance. Why modern churches still avoid correcting this, even when scholars admit the visuals are inaccurate. Because once something becomes sacred tradition, truth alone is no longer enough to move it. By now, the historical reality isn't controversial among scholars. Biblical figures were Middle Eastern and North African. Many lived in regions populated by darker-skinned peoples. That is accepted in academia. So the real question isn't, were the prophets black or brown? It's, why hasn't the imagery been corrected? Because correcting it costs power. Modern Christianity isn't just theology, it's infrastructure, institutions, funding, geopolitics, and cultural authority. And those systems were built on visual narratives that placed Europe at the spiritual center. Change the image, and you reopen ownership. Let's be precise. Most seminaries quietly acknowledge that European depictions are inaccurate. Art historians admit Renaissance imagery reflected European norms, not ancient reality. Biblical geographers confirm Africa's deep integration into Israelite history. Yet the images remain. Why? Because churches do not operate on evidence alone. They operate on continuity. If congregations suddenly see prophets with African features, questions follow immediately. Why weren't we shown this before? Who decided the old images? What else was changed? Those questions don't end at art. They move toward doctrine, authority, and tradition. That's why institutions resist. Now look at curriculum. Sunday schools, children's Bibles, illustrated study guides. These are mass-produced. Replacing imagery would require admitting error on a massive scale. Institutions don't like public admissions that destabilize trust, so instead, they choose inertia. Next layer, racial hierarchy. Christianity expanded globally during European colonial rule. Missionaries carried not just scripture, but European identity. The unspoken message was clear. Closeness to God looked European. That association helped justify conquest, conversion, and control. Undoing that imagery threatens the moral framing of empire, which is why the correction stalls. Now, let's talk about Africa's role in early Christianity. Christianity did not spread from Rome outward. It spread simultaneously across Africa and the Near East. Alexandria, Egypt was one of the earliest centers of Christian scholarship. Some of the first theologians, translators, and bishops were African. Origen, Tertullian, Athanasius. These weren't marginal figures. They shaped doctrine. Yet their Africanness is minimized or ignored in popular narratives. Why? Because it disrupts the idea that Europe inherited the faith first. Now consider Ethiopia. Christianity reached Ethiopia in the 1st century, not through Europe, through Africa. The Ethiopian church preserved texts, liturgy, and traditions that predate European standardization. And yet Ethiopia is treated as an outlier, not foundational. That framing is intentional, because acknowledging African seniority in the faith forces reevaluation of who shaped Christianity and who later claimed it. Now let's address scriptural description directly. The Bible itself provides physical cues that contradict European imagery, descriptions of hair texture, skin tone metaphors, geographic placement. These aren't poetic accidents. They reflect lived reality. But modern churches downplay literal readings when they conflict with tradition. Suddenly, Symbolism becomes the defense. Skin color doesn't matter. Focus on the message. It's spiritual, not physical. Those arguments only appear after whiteness is established. They weren't used when imagery was being standardized. Now look at global Christianity today. The majority of Christians live in Africa, Latin America, and Asia, yet visual authority still centers Europe. That imbalance persists because changing imagery feels like changing ownership. Now here's the part institutions don't want addressed. If prophets were black or brown, then black faith is not derivative. It is ancestral. That challenges narratives that position African spirituality as converted rather than inherited, and that has consequences. It reshapes identity, it reframes history, and it forces institutions to explain why African Christianity was treated as secondary when it was never late. This is why corrections are slow, not because evidence is lacking, but because authority is at stake. And here's the truth most people don't want to confront. The resistance isn't theological, it's psychological. People grow up seeing sacred figures reflected as familiar. That familiarity becomes comfort. Comfort becomes truth. Changing that feels like loss, even if the original image was inaccurate, which is why pushback today often sounds emotional rather than factual. Now let's move toward resolution. The issue isn't replacing white images with black ones. It's restoring accuracy, acknowledging context, recognizing that sacred history did not emerge in Europe and did not look European. That doesn't erase anyone. It corrects everyone. The final chunks will answer two remaining questions: why this conversation resurfaces now, and why it can't be buried again, and why correcting this history doesn't weaken faith. It strengthens it, because truth doesn't threaten belief. It threatens control. This conversation isn't happening by accident. It's happening now because the systems that controlled information for centuries are breaking down. For most of history, access to biblical manuscripts, art archives, archaeological findings, and academic commentary was restricted, controlled by churches, universities, and publishing houses concentrated in Europe and North America. That gatekeeping shaped what people saw, and therefore what they believed. Today, that control is collapsing. Digitization changed everything. Ancient manuscripts are online. Museum archives are searchable. Ethiopian, Coptic, Syriac, and Arabic texts are accessible without permission from Western institutions. Once that happened, patterns became visible. People started comparing sources instead of trusting summaries. And when comparisons happen, inconsistencies surface. That's why this discussion is exploding now. Not because the information is new, but because access is. Second reason, global Christianity no longer belongs to Europe. Statistically, the center of Christianity has shifted south. Africa is now the fastest growing Christian population on earth. Latin America follows closely. Europe is shrinking. That demographic shift forces theological discomfort, because when African Christians ask basic questions, why do all the prophets look European? The old answers don't satisfy. They never did. But now, the audience is large enough to challenge it publicly. Third reason, archaeology keeps undermining old narratives. Modern archaeology no longer relies on European racial assumptions from the 1800s. DNA studies, burial analysis, climate anthropology all confirm that ancient Near Eastern populations were darker than modern European depictions. Scholars know this. The difference now is that independent researchers and educators can amplify those findings without institutional filters, which means contradictions can no longer be quietly footnoted. Fourth reason, identity pressure. For centuries, black spirituality was framed as something acquired, converted, imported, or borrowed. That framing shapes psychological hierarchy. If sacred authority is European, then African faith becomes secondary by default. But once people realize that African and Semitic worlds were deeply interconnected, historically, linguistically, and culturally, that hierarchy collapses. And people feel that shift. It creates cognitive friction. That friction produces backlash, which is why opposition to this topic is emotional, not academic. Now let's address the resistance head on. You'll hear this response constantly. Why does race matter? It matters because race was used to define authority. If imagery didn't matter, it wouldn't have been standardized. If race didn't matter, prophets wouldn't have been reimagined to reflect European norms. The moment race stopped serving power, it suddenly became irrelevant. That's not coincidence, that's revision. Now let's talk about why this can't be buried again, because too many independent lines of evidence now converge. Textual geography, historical migration, artistic conventions, anthropology, early church demographics. You don't need all of them to be perfect. You need them to agree, and they do. Ancient Israel existed at the crossroads of Africa and Asia. Egypt wasn't peripheral, it was central. Ethiopia wasn't distant, it was connected. Arabia wasn't separate, it was intertwined. This wasn't a pale, isolated world. It was dark, diverse, and mobile. And that reality is now too well documented to erase again. Another reason this resurfaces: young audiences don't inherit institutional loyalty. They don't defend traditions just because they're old. They ask if they're accurate. That's dangerous for systems built on assumption, especially when those assumptions shaped identity for centuries. Now here's the part that most critics avoid addressing. Correcting imagery does not attack belief, it attacks misrepresentation. Faith doesn't require false visuals. Truth doesn't threaten spirituality. What it threatens is control over narrative. And that's why pushback often sounds like, "This is divisive. This creates unnecessary tension. This distracts from the message." Those phrases are used whenever authority feels challenged, not when evidence is weak. Now let's be clear about one thing. This isn't about claiming exclusivity. It's about restoring context. The prophets didn't belong to Europe. They didn't belong to Africa either. They belonged to the ancient Near East, a region shaped by Africa more than Europe ever was. That distinction matters, because once context is restored, false hierarchies dissolve. Now we move toward the final conclusion. If the Bible was whitewashed, it wasn't accidental. It wasn't artistic coincidence. It was a byproduct of empire, transmission, and institutional preference. And once you see that, the final question becomes unavoidable. What does faith look like when it's no longer filtered through empire? That's where this ends. Once the whitewashed image collapses, the damage isn't theological, it's structural. Because the Bible didn't just shape belief, it shaped authority. For centuries, European institutions positioned themselves as the natural interpreters of Scripture. That authority was reinforced visually. When prophets looked European churches felt inevitable. When sacred authority looked white, whiteness felt divinely aligned. That alignment was never stated outright. It didn't need to be. It was absorbed. When imagery shifts back toward historical reality, something immediate happens. Interpretive monopoly breaks. Suddenly, African, Middle Eastern, and non-European communities are no longer reading into the text. They're reading from within it. That recenters power. This is why the reaction is so intense, not because belief is threatened, but because hierarchy is. Here's what actually changes when people accept that biblical figures were darker, Semitic, African adjacent, and non-European. Authority decouples from Europe once prophets are no longer imagined as white. European Christianity loses its assumed default status, not its validity, its dominance. European theology becomes one tradition among many, not the source code. That forces a reevaluation of doctrines, interpretations, and moral frameworks that were treated as universal but were culturally specific. This is uncomfortable, especially for institutions built on inherited authority rather than evidence. African and Near Eastern Christianity regain historical depth. African Christianity stops being framed as a later adoption. It becomes what it historically was: early, native, and foundational. Ethiopia wasn't waiting for Europe to arrive. North Africa wasn't peripheral. The Nile Valley wasn't outside the story. It was central to it. When that context returns, African faith traditions stop being viewed as derivatives and start being understood as continuations. That shift matters psychologically. It reorients dignity. Conversion narratives collapse. For centuries, Christianity in Africa was framed as something delivered by missionaries. That story only works if Christianity itself is imagined as European. Once you recognize that Christianity was African before it was European, the missionary narrative flips. Europe didn't bring faith to Africa. Africa preserved faith while Europe was still pagan. That inversion destabilizes moral authority, and that's why it was resisted. Racial theology loses legitimacy. Whitewashed imagery wasn't neutral. It supported the idea that moral order flowed downward from Europe. That belief justified colonization, hierarchy, and racial ranking. Once prophets are understood as non-European, that structure loses its sacred justification. Hierarchy becomes political instead of divine, which means it can be challenged. Scripture becomes geographically real again. When prophets look European, Scripture feels abstract, mythical, detached from real land and people. When they're restored to their actual environment, sun exposed, Semitic, African adjacent, the Bible becomes grounded. It stops being an ethereal European fantasy and becomes a record of real communities navigating empire, oppression, exile, and survival. That grounding strengthens faith rather than weakens it, because reality is harder to manipulate. Control shifts from institutions to individuals. Once people realize imagery was altered, they start asking what else was simplified. They read text directly, they compare translations, they look up geography, they notice inconsistencies. That curiosity undermines passive belief. Institutions lose control not because they're wrong, but because they're no longer unquestioned. That's why access, not ideology, is the real threat. Identity recenters without supremacy. This is important. Correcting imagery does not mean replacing white supremacy with black supremacy. That's a straw man. It means removing supremacy altogether. The prophets weren't white. They weren't modern racial categories at all. They were ancient peoples shaped by climate, migration, and geography. Recognizing that doesn't elevate one group above another. It removes false elevation entirely. Now let's address the fear beneath the backlash. People worry that changing imagery will destabilize belief systems built over generations. But belief systems built on inaccurate visuals were already unstable. Truth doesn't destroy faith. It destroys illusions, and illusions always collapse eventually. The only question is whether the collapse is voluntary or forced. Here's the reality. Institutions don't like to admit the Bible survives scrutiny, empire doesn't. Whitewashing wasn't about protecting faith. It was about protecting dominance during transmission. Once that dominance ends, faith doesn't vanish. It diversifies. Which brings us to the final point. If prophets weren't white, then morality isn't racial. Authority isn't inherited, and interpretation isn't owned, it's shared. That realization is destabilizing only to systems that depended on silence, which leads directly to the final conclusion. Here's the question. No institution once asked, if the Bible was visually altered, what was the purpose? Not how it happened. Not when. Why? Because accidental drift doesn't behave like this. When mistakes occur organically, they vary. They contradict each other. They correct themselves over time. This didn't. The whitening of biblical figures was consistent, directional, and global. That means intent. Let's strip this down to facts. The earliest physical evidence contradicts modern imagery. We are not guessing. We have ancient Near Eastern reliefs, Egyptian wall paintings, Roman descriptions, Byzantine mosaics, early Ethiopian and Syriac manuscripts. They agree on one thing. The people of the biblical world were dark-complexioned, Semitic, Afro-Asiatic, shaped by sun, climate, and region. None resemble medieval European features. Yet by the 1400s, 1600s, biblical art in Europe undergoes a sudden transformation. Skin lightens, hair straightens, facial structure shifts north. This is not gradual evolution. It is replacement. The shift matches power, not theology. The whitening accelerates during the rise of European empires, the transatlantic trade era, the colonization of Africa and the Americas, At the exact moment Europe claims global authority, its religious imagery mirrors that authority. That is not coincidence. That is alignment. If prophets look European, European rule feels ordained. That visual logic mattered more than doctrine, because visuals bypass literacy. They bypass debate. They imprint. Translation didn't just change words, it changed emphasis. Certain physical descriptors were softened or reframed. References to dark skin, wool-textured hair, sun exposure. African geography were minimized, footnoted, or reinterpreted symbolically. Not removed, neutralized. Enough to keep the text intact, but the image pliable. That's how power edits without erasing. This wasn't done to deceive believers. It was done to manage populations. Churches weren't trying to destroy faith. They were trying to export it under control. When Christianity moved into Africa and the Americas, it was paired with European identity. That pairing only works if sacred authority looks European. If people see prophets who look like them, hierarchy collapses. So the image had to change. Not because truth was dangerous, because equality was. Why didn't the text change more? Because texts invite comparison. Images feel final. An image doesn't ask questions. It tells you what is normal. That's why art mattered more than scripture. That's why stained glass did more work than sermons. The pushback today proves the point. If this discussion were irrelevant, no one would care. But the reaction is intense because the implications are immediate. If prophets weren't white, moral authority isn't racial European dominance, isn't sacred colonial theology. Loses justification. African history stops being peripheral. Identity detaches from hierarchy. That destabilizes narratives that still benefit people today. This is not about replacing one myth with another. This is important. This isn't about saying everyone was black. That's modern thinking imposed backward. This is about restoring regional reality. Ancient peoples were not modern races. They were sun-shaped, land-shaped, migration-shaped. Trying to make them European was the distortion. Restoring them removes distortion. It doesn't create a new one. Why this matters now? Because people are reading again. They're comparing translations. They're seeing archaeology. They're noticing geography. And once someone sees the disconnect between the land of the Bible and the faces painted onto it, the illusion breaks permanently. You cannot unsee context. The final truth. The Bible was not whitened to honor God. It was whitened to protect authority during empire. Faith survived. Power needed camouflage. That's why this history was minimized instead of debated. Debate implies uncertainty. Silence implies control. And silence only works until people ask better questions. Which brings us to the end. Not a conclusion, a responsibility. Because once you know imagery was altered, you have a choice. Ignore it. Or stop letting visuals override evidence. The Bible doesn't need defending, it needs context. And context always favors truth over dominance. That's the point.